Lee opened. If you have ever been judged by the way you looked instead of the person you actually are, this story is for you, and I promise, by the end of it, you will believe again that kindness always finds its way back. Before we start, Lee opened, hit that like button and subscribe, because stories like deserve to reach every person who needs a reminder that the universe keeps score. Now, let's begin. Lee opened. Marcus Reyes had exactly $43 in his checking account. One clean shirt that wasn't actually clean, Lee opened, and a job interview tomorrow morning that felt less like an opportunity and more like his exit ramp before everything collapsed. He was 42 years old, a widower for the past 3 years. Lee opened, and the sole parent to an 8-year-old daughter named Lily, who still asked every single night if her daddy was going to be okay. He always said yes. He was starting to wonder if he was lying. The apartment they lived in was small. Lee opened, the kind of small where you could hear the refrigerator hum from every room. And lately, that refrigerator held more ketchup packets than actual food. Lee opened. Marcus had been an operations manager at a mid-sized logistics company for 11 years. Before the folded and in the 18 months since, he had sent out over 300 applications. 300. Lee opened. He had stopped counting the rejections after the first 100 because counting them felt like counting wounds. But something about the email that came in last week felt different. Northbridge Industries. Lee opened, one of the fastest-growing supply chain and technology firms in the country, was hiring a senior operations director. The role paid nearly triple what he used to make. It was, frankly, Lee opened, a role far above what a man in his situation should have realistically expected to land an interview for. And yet somehow, after 3 rounds of phone screenings, Lee opened, he had made it to the final in-person headquarters. Tomorrow, 9 in the morning. Top floor, it needed to be dress shirt. He had to be dry cleaned, and dry cleaning cost money he technically didn't have. Lee opened, so instead he washed it by hand in the bathroom sink the night before and hung it to dry would be ready in time. He pressed his one pair of dress sport pants with sif, the travel iron that barely got warm anymore. Lee opened. He told Lily a bedtime story about a knight who had to fight a dragon with a rusty sword because it was the only sword he had, and how the rust didn't matter, because the knight's heart was sharper than any blade. Lee opened. He wasn't sure if he was telling her that story or telling himself the next morning everything that could go wrong did. His shirt was still slightly damp when he put it on. Lee opened, and by the time he'd walked 6 blocks to catch 2 buses because his car had been repossessed 2 months earlier, sweat and humidity had turned slightly damp into visibly wrinkled with a faint water stain near the collar. Lee opened. His bus was delayed. Then, walking along the shoulder of a rain-slicked 2-lane road that cut through an industrial stretch of the city, he saw a silver sedan pulled over with its hazards blinking. Lee opened, hood popped, and a woman standing beside it in obvious distress, her phone held up uselessly for signal. Marcus almost kept walking. He had an interview to get to. He was already cutting it close. Lee opened, but he had been raised by a mother who used to say that character is what you do when it costs you something, not when it's convenient. He jogged over. Rain soaking further into his already imperfect shirt, Lee opened and asked if she needed help. The woman was maybe in her late teens, auburn hair pulled back, dressed like she belonged in a boardroom rather than a highway shoulder. She explained her car had simply died. Lee opened. No warning lights, nothing, and she'd been stuck 20 minutes with no signal. Marcus, who had spent a decade fixing his own aging vehicles, because dealership repairs were never in the family budget, popped the hood. Lee opened, and found a loose battery terminal corroded just enough to lose connection over bumps in the road. He didn't have proper tools, but he had a pocket knife, a relaxing stubbornness. 10 minutes later, Lee opened. The engine turned over. The woman thanked him for cash, which he politely declined, not out of pride exactly, but because helping someone stranded on the side of the road wasn't a transaction. To him. Lee opened. She asked his name. He told her Marcus. She told him hers was Elena. Shook his hand, and that was that. He checked his watch. Lee opened. realized he now had 11 minutes to make an interview that was 25 minutes away and took off running, drenched, disheveled, and now unmistakably late. He opened. He arrived at Northbridge Industries 8 minutes past his scheduled time, breathless, his shirt clinging to him with rainwater and sweat, a faint grease smudge on his cuff from the car battery, his hair a mess. He opened, his dress pants splashed with mud from a puddle he hadn't seen in time. The lobby was the kind of place that made you feel underdressed, just by existing, soaring glass ceilings. He opened, marble floors so polished you could see your own nervous reflection, executives in 5,000 difference of people who had never once worried about rent, who had never once gone. Then he opened. The receptionist looked him up and down with poorly concealed distaste before directing him to the waiting area outside the executive conference room. He opened. 2 junior associates walking by slowed their pace just enough to exchange a look and a smirk. One of them, loud enough for Marcus to hear, murmured something to the other about maintenance staff being in the wrong lobby. He opened. Marcus said nothing. He sat down, straightened his damp collar as best he could, and waited. The wait was its own kind of torment. Every few minutes another candidate walked past, sharp suits, leather briefcases. He opened, confident strides, glancing at him with a mixture of confusion and pity, clearly wondering how he'd made it to the final round at all. A member of the hiring committee. He opened. A stiff man named Donner phone screen walked out at one point, looked at him, "Bill," and simply said, "We'll call you when we're ready." He opened, in a tone that suggested he did not expect that the call come soon or at all. Marcus felt something in his chest tighten, not just embarrassment, but the specific hollow shame of knowing that everything riding on this moment. He opened. His daughter's future, his family's stability, was about to be dismissed because of wet fabric and bad timing. He thought about leaving. He thought about how much easier it would be to walk out now. He opened, before the rejection scrap of dignity. But he thought of Lily asking if he was going to be okay, and he thought of the rusty sword in the story he'd told her. And he stayed. 40 long minutes later, he opened. His name was finally called. Not by an assistant who informed him, almost apologetically, that the final round would actually take place directly with the company's founder and CEO, one floor up. He opened, in the executive boardroom, for the final candidate. Marcus felt his stomach drop with a strange mixture of hope and dread. He straightened his jacket one final. He opened, futile time, and rode the elevator up in silence. When the boardroom room with floor-to-glass city skyline, overlooking the entire city skyline, glowing gold in the late afternoon light. He opened. Around him members of the hiring committee, including Donald Pierce, all looking mildly irritated at the delay. And at the head of the table, the seat of the table, in the seat of ultimate authority, he opened, sat a woman with auburn hair and sharp hazel eyes. Stopped walking. His breath caught somewhere between his throat and his chest. It was her, the woman from the highway. Elena Cross rose from her chair. He opened, and instead of the polite professional greeting the room expected, she smiled, a real warm smile, and said, "Marcus, I was hoping it would be you." The room fell into confused silence. Donald Pierce blinked. He opened, glancing between his CEO and the disheveled candidate he had quietly written off an hour earlier. Elena turned to address her stunned executive committee. She explained calmly and without a hint of embarrassment. He opened that earlier that morning her car had broken down on a deserted road, that she had been stranded with no way called for help. This stranger, Marcus Reyes, had stopped everything he was doing. He opened, gotten his hands dirty, refused payment, and asked for nothing in return except to make sure she got where she needed to go safely. She told them that the same grease stain on his cuff that had made lobby staff sneer at him was, He opened in her mind, the single most important qualification in the entire room. "We spend hours in interviews asking candidates to describe their integrity," Elena said. He opened, looking directly at Donald. Question. "I don't need to ask Marcus that question. I watched him live it, on the side of not of a highway, with no one watching and nothing to gain. opened. She said that in 11 years of building Northbridge from a two-person startup into a global operation, she had learned that clean suits could be bought, but character could not. Opened, and that she would rather build her leadership team around a man who helped a stranger while soaking wet and running late to his own interview than around someone who had simply memorized the right answer. The committee, opened, moments earlier ready to dismiss him without a second thought, now sat in stunned silence, several of them visibly reevaluated assumed. Elena then turned back to Marcus, who was still standing near the doorway. Opened, half in shock, and offered him not just senior operations director position he'd applied for, opened, but a newly created vice president of operations role. A position with nearly 10 times the compensation and stability of what he'd originally expected, full benefits, and a leadership seat directly under her. Opened, Marcus stood there for a long moment, overwhelmed, his mind racing back through 18 months of rejection, 300 applications, hand-washed shirts, and a daughter who deserved so much better than ketchup packet dinners. Opened, he accepted, his voice cracking slightly as he said thank you, and Elena simply nodded and said, "Thank you for stopping." That evening, Marcus called home the moment he stepped outside the building. Opened, the city lights beginning to glow around him. Lily picked up, breathless with the kind of hope only children carry so openly, and asked if he got the job. Marcus, standing on a sidewalk in his damp, opened, wrinkled shirt that had somehow become the very thing that saved him, told her yesterday not just that he got a job, but that their entire life was about to change. He told her that sometimes the rusty sword works after all. Opened, but because of the art behind the hand holding it. In the months that followed, Marcus rebuilt his family's life from the ground up. Bashikas, a stable home, savings for the first time in years. Opened, Lily enrolled in the school she'd always dreamed of attending. But more than any of that, he carried forward the lesson Elena had given her entire boardroom that day. Opened, that judging people by their appearance blinds you to who they really are, and this single act of unwitnessed kindness can quietly become the bridge over the widest gap in your life. Years later, opened, when Marcus himself sat on hiring committees at Northbridge, he made it a point to never dismiss a candidate for arriving in a wrinkled shirt or muddy shoes. He remembered exactly what it felt like to be seen as less than. Opened, and he remembered exactly who had chosen to see him as more. And every time he told this story to a new employee about a first impression gone, he ended it the same way. Dress your character every single day. Opened, because you never know which stranded stranger on the side of the road might just be the one holding the door to your future, and it might just open for you, simply because you were kind first.